Ancient Egyptians risked death to trade in secret night markets where magic, crime, and forbidden treasures were sold. And these places were so hidden that history almost erased them. Welcome back, friend. Welcome to the night markets of ancient Egypt. You're standing in ancient Egypt, right as the sun kisses the Nile goodbye. The city glows gold for a moment, then fades into copper shadows. Priests lock the temple doors, merchants drag carts back from the square, and kids chase each other through the dust, kicking up one last storm before night. It feels orderly, predictable, everything in its proper place. But hold that image, because the second the light dies, Egypt flips. And you're about to see a version of this world you were never meant to witness. Here's the kicker. Egyptians loved order. Daytime life was choreographed like a ritual. The market bell rang, stalls opened, priests blessed the bread, scribes counted grain. You bought what you needed, grain, pottery, maybe a little beer if you felt cheeky, and then the show was over. Done. Pack up, go home. That's the Egypt carved in stone. That's the Egypt on postcards. But people are people. And people don't stop wanting just because the sun clocked out. A priest once warned, there are things best left unseen by day. He wasn't talking about ghosts. He was talking about the living, the deals, the hunger, the chaos that slipped out only after dark. Day was sacred, night was temptation. And here's the brutal irony. The same city that prayed to Ra, the sun god, also came alive the second Ra went to bed. Picture the daytime market, grain stacked in tall baskets smelling like warm flour, jars of oil glinting in the sun, clay pots lined up like soldiers, fish sizzling on flat pans while flies buzzed in a frenzy. Every deal recorded, every price fixed, every seller in their place. But try to sneak an extra scoop of barley. You'd get dragged to a scribe, fined, maybe shamed in front of your neighbors. Egypt's laws didn't play. Bread wasn't just bread. It was survival, tax, wages. Cheat on bread, you cheat on life itself. That's why markets shut down tight before sunset. The officials couldn't risk things getting messy. No shadows, no backroom deals. At least that's what the officials thought. But let's be real, laws are just invitations for people to get creative. The cracks in daylight order were exactly where night markets found space to crawl in. And here's the twist. Archaeologists don't have neon signs saying, "Welcome to the night market." What they have, graffiti carved at odd hours, shrines to nocturnal gods smeared with candle wax, references to late-night offerings, bits of broken pottery scattered in places no daytime market ever stood. It's like finding beer cans after a party that never happened. Want the gut punch? These scraps suggest people didn't just bend the rules, they built whole secret economies once the sun dipped. Now imagine this from the ground level. You're a farmer, sweaty, pockets light. You sold your grain by day, but it wasn't enough. Your kid's hungry. Or maybe you just want something the official market won't allow. An extra jug of wine, a charm against a jealous neighbor, maybe even something spicier. Where do you go? Not to the temples, not to the main square. You wait. You slip into the alleys and you follow the torches because the night market is starting. And that's where Egypt stops being a postcard and starts being human. So let's rewind. Before the torches, before the whispers, before the back alley chaos, you've got to understand what normal Egypt looked like. Daytime Egypt was a machine. Every person had a role. Farmers grew barley, bakers kneaded dough, potters spun clay into jars, women brought baskets of onions and garlic to trade, kids carried bundles of reeds or helped grind grain. The market was the heartbeat of daily life, but it was a heartbeat on a leash. You couldn't just roll up and sell anything. Prices were regulated, weights were checked. If your loaf was light, you weren't a baker, you were a thief. And thieves didn't just get fined, they got shamed. Imagine being paraded with your bread tied around your neck, everyone laughing, your reputation roasted alive in the sun. The system was brutal because it had to be. Egypt lived on the edge of survival. One bad harvest and people starved. That's why the pharaoh's officials counted every sack of grain like it was gold. In fact, it was gold. Grain was wages, taxes, offerings. Bread wasn't just food, it was currency. And here's the irony. In daylight, Egypt pretended it was unshakable, eternal, perfect. But under the surface, cracks everywhere. Picture this. You're a fisherman. The river gave you too many tilapia today. The market's closed. The scribes are asleep, but your catch will rot before sunrise. Do you toss it, or do you slip into the alleys and sell it to anyone willing to pay a few copper pieces? That's how necessity bends law. And once bending starts, breaking is never far behind. Now here's the twist. Night markets weren't just about food. That would be too simple. The day markets had food handled. The night, that's where things got weird. Love spells scrawled on scraps of papyrus. Amulets said to curse your rivals. Jars of beer stronger than the temple allowed. Even stolen relics from tombs, passed hand to hand under torchlight. You didn't go there for bread. You went there for things daylight would never approve. And if you're thinking, okay, but wouldn't the priests or guards shut it down? Here's the kicker. Sometimes they were the customers. Power doesn't erase desire, it just teaches you how to hide it better. But there's a darker edge. Imagine the smell, incense mixed with sweat, fried fish, and a sour tang of beer. The sound, low bargaining voices, laughter that cuts off too quick, the clink of metal. And always the fear, what if you're caught? Because Egypt didn't forgive. Break the law in daylight, you faced public shame. Break it at night, you might face worse. Stocks, beatings, even exile. Yet still, the markets thrived. Why? Because Egypt's official world was only half the truth. The other half, the shadow half, belonged to survival, desire, and rebellion. Archaeologists find hints of it, graffiti carved at odd hours, like someone couldn't sleep without scratching their presence into stone. Little shrines to gods of the night, stained with wax drippings. Trash piles full of pottery shards where no official market stood. Each clue whispers the same thing. Life didn't shut off when the sun went down. It just moved underground.
Want the gut punch? Most of what we know is speculation stitched from fragments. Scholars argue about it. Some say night markets were rare, others say they were vital. But think about it. Humans have always made black markets. Romans had them, medieval towns had them, modern cities have them. Do you really think ancient Egypt, the cradle of civilization, somehow didn't? And that's the crazy part. The Egyptians built pyramids that touched the sky, temples carved with divine order. But behind all that stone and ceremony, people were still sneaking around at night, chasing the same messy human cravings we all have. So here's where you stand now. The sun is gone. The official markets are locked tight. The priests have made their blessings. The scribes have rolled up their scrolls. On the surface, Egypt sleeps. But listen, do you hear it? That shuffle of sandals in the alley, that crack of laughter cut short, that flicker of torchlight at the edge of the street. The day is dead. The night market is alive. And the question is, are you stepping into it? Or are you walking away? Because you won't like what happens next. Is where things start to unravel. For centuries, scholars painted Egypt as a kingdom of sunlight, trade by day, worship by day, law by day. The night was for sleeping, or, if you believe the priests, for fighting off chaos itself. But then, archaeologists started digging, and what they pulled up didn't fit the postcard. Picture this: lamps. Not temple lamps, not ritual offerings, just clusters of cheap clay oil lamps scattered in places they shouldn't be. Near kitty gates, around temple precincts, tucked into little side alleys of Thebes and Memphis. And not one or two, piles of them, burnt, cracked, used, the kind of vendor would need if he was selling after dark. And here's the kicker. Alongside those lamps, scraps of food, fish bones, seeds, burnt bread. Exactly the kind of trash you'd expect after a crowd ate quickly and left. You don't find that in temples. You find it where people bought, sold, and gossiped. Now imagine being the first archaeologist to piece this together. You're brushing dirt off a shard of pottery when it hits you. This isn't ritual. This is a night market.
And the gut punch? It means Egypt didn't shut down at sunset. The city kept breathing in secret. Then come the papyri, ancient administrative documents written in looping hieroglyphs and dusty ink, translated word by word. And tucked inside, strange phrases, evening bazaars, night fairs. At first, scholars thought it was metaphor, but the context, grain tallies, trade exemptions, mentions of food stalls near temple festivals, that's not poetry, that's logistics. Wait, so the ancients themselves admitted there were night markets? Kind of. They're vague, slippery. Maybe sanctioned festivals, maybe side hustle bazaars. But either way, they show something big. Egyptians weren't just creatures of the sun. They needed the night too. This is the smoking gun that shatters the clean daylight myth. And now the argument begins. Because if you think Egyptologists agree on this, forget it. Some say these markets were tolerated, maybe even encouraged during big festivals. Imagine priests turning a blind eye while people bought trinkets and drank beer after a temple parade. Others argue the opposite. These were illegal, underground, a slap in the face to divine order. So the question becomes, were night markets just poor farmers trying to survive? Or were they rebellious acts against the gods themselves? Picture the scene. A priest standing at the edge of a square, watching shadows gather. He knows the rules, commerce ends at sunset. But there's a crowd. Torches flicker, coins jingle. Someone laughs too loud. Does he shut it down? Or does he pretend he didn't see? Because maybe, just maybe, he's planning to slip by later to buy a charm for himself. That's the irony. Even in a kingdom obsessed with order, human desire kept poking holes through the script. Now flip it. Imagine the legal scribes. Their papyri list strict hours, daylight rituals, proper festivals, and then, hidden between the lines, little clauses, except during certain events, permitted for special offerings. Tiny cracks of legal wiggle room. If you know the right people, if you whisper to the right guard, suddenly, night trade doesn't look so dangerous.
But the crazy part, most scholars agree on one thing. If night markets existed, they were never official. They were tolerated at best, condemned at worst. A liminal space, half legal, half forbidden. Like the city's dirty little secret everyone knew, but no one admitted. Think about the stakes. By day,
Egypt showed you its perfect face: sunlit temples, orderly markets, laws carved in stone. But at night, the mask slipped. Immigrants, laborers, entertainers, even thieves, all gathering in torchlight to buy, sell, and survive. And that's when the gut punch lands. Because stepping into the night market isn't just walking into a different space, it's walking into an upside-down Egypt. By day, priests and officials control trade. By night, outsiders and hustlers carve their own economy. By day, light equals order, darkness equals chaos. By night, chaos is exactly what people need to live. The moment you realize this, the story tilts. You can't go back to the postcard version of Egypt anymore. The question is, are you brave enough to walk into that torchlit chaos and see what they were really selling? Because we're about to break in. So you're standing at the edge. Daylight Egypt is behind you. Safe, regulated, predictable. The scribes have rolled up their papyri. The guards have vanished into the barracks. The priests are whispering prayers to help Ra survive his nightly battle against chaos. And yet here you are, staring into the dark. This is the break, the point where you can't unsee the evidence, can't unhear the whispers, because whether sanctioned or secret, these night markets existed, and stepping inside them is like flipping Egypt upside down. By day, merchants wore authority like armor, grain sellers watched by officials, bakers tested for weight, potters lined up in neat rows. But at night, forget hierarchy, forget rules. The night market wasn't built for scribes. It was built for everyone who didn't fit. Imagine the crowd. Immigrants freshly off Nile boats, clutching small goods to sell. Entertainers with drums, their rhythms echoing off temple walls. Laborers, pockets heavy with the day's wages, looking for a way to burn them through. And in the shadows, traders who'd never be welcome under Ra's eye. Here's the kicker. This was freedom, wrapped in danger. In daylight, you couldn't sell a charm against your boss, or a stronger brew of beer than the priests allowed, or a relic that looked suspiciously stolen. But at night, the rules blurred. A fishmonger could sell his extra catch. A potter could bargain without temple tax. A farmer's wife could swap onions for a scrap of cloth. It wasn't just economy, it was survival. And here's the brutal irony. What Egypt tried to suppress by day, it nurtured by night. Because without these secret markets, the poor stayed poorer, the outsiders stayed outside, the hungry went hungrier.
Think about the smell. Not incense this time. Smoke from makeshift grills, fried fish, cheap beer, the musk of sweating bodies packed too close. The sound of coins clinking in hands that weren't supposed to hold them. Laughter that carried a nervous edge because everyone knew the risk. Step further in. A man hawks amulets shaped like cats, promising they'll protect your home. Another whispers about charms that could ruin your neighbor's harvest. A musician bangs a drum while a dancer sways, her bracelets jingling. Every sense tells you this isn't the Egypt carved in stone. This is Egypt raw, alive, unfiltered. And here's the twist. This wasn't just trade. It was rebellion in miniature. Every transaction said, "We exist outside your order." Every bargain whispered, "Your rules don't own us." But it came at a cost. If the guards caught you, stocks, fines, beatings, maybe worse. The priests would call it chaos. The officials would call it crime. And yet, night after night, people came back. Why? Because once you taste freedom, even in the form of a cheap beer or a forbidden charm, you can't go back to being just another name in the scribe's tally. So here's where the story pivots. We've left the safe streets of daylight Egypt. We've broken into the alleys, into the torchlight, into the noise. This is the upside-down world, the secret Egypt where the margins of society run the show. And if you think the day markets were intense, wait until you see what the night had to offer. Because here's the thing, you haven't even seen the strangest stalls yet. Step further into the market and something shifts. The noise doesn't just sound like trade anymore, it sounds like ritual. Torches flare, drums thud like a heartbeat, and suddenly you realize this isn't just economy. This is spirituality, theater, magic. Because in Egypt, night wasn't empty. Night was alive with gods. Take Khonsu, the moon god. His pale glow wasn't just light, it was protection, healing, the rhythm of time itself. When the sun disappeared into the underworld, Khonsu kept watch, his silver lamp burning across the Nile. A vendor selling charms beneath that glow wasn't just doing business, he was borrowing divine legitimacy. Each amulet promised not just profit, but protection in a world teetering on chaos. And then there was Nut, the goddess whose body arched across the sky, swallowing the sun each evening, only to birth it back every dawn. Under her vast star-dappled body, Egyptians imagined safety. The night wasn't lawless, it was womb-like, cyclical, sacred. And night markets humming beneath her gaze became extensions of that theology, gatherings that thrived in her shelter. That's the paradox. What priests condemned as chaos, ordinary people reframed as opportunity. A nighttime fair wasn't rebellion, it was alignment with gods who ruled the hours after dusk. And sometimes, the line blurred entirely. Festivals proved it. Certain temples staged nocturnal ceremonies, ritual dramas honoring the moon, the stars, or Osiris's passage through the underworld. Crowds gathered after sunset, drawn by music, torches, and offerings, and alongside the sacred, stalls bloomed. Vendors slipped in, selling food, trinkets, charms. The sacred procession turned into a bazaar. Prayer and purchase folded together. Picture it, priests chanting invocations to Khonsu, while just beyond the temple gates, a woman hawks roasted fish to the hungry crowd. Someone sells cheap beer. Someone else whispers about protective spells written on scraps of papyrus. The festival became market. The market became festival. An ecosystem the daylight authorities couldn't completely suppress because it was sanctioned by ritual itself. And that's where the myth bled into daily survival. The Book of the Dead tells us the night was dangerous, an underworld full of serpents, demons, and gates guarded by gods who demanded passwords and spells. To move safely, souls needed magic, amulets, incantations, charms, and guess what? Those same objects circulated in night markets. Buy a cat-shaped amulet, and you weren't just accessorizing, you were preparing for eternity. The night bazaar wasn't only commerce, it was a rehearsal for the afterlife. But it wasn't all fear and magic. The night also carried joy. When the stalls opened, so did the mouths of storytellers. Imagine sitting on a reed mat, cheap beer in hand, while a professional reciter launches into a tale of gods tricking each other or pharaohs proving their divine right. Musicians plucked strings, drums pounded, dancers spun. The market wasn't just where you bought things, it was where you belonged. Stories bound people together, transmitting lessons, history, and laughter in the same breath. And those stories mattered. They didn't just entertain, they rewired collective memory. Every time a tale of Ra's nightly battle was retold, or a fable about greed and betrayal was spun, the community absorbed its moral. Night markets weren't just about surviving the darkness, They were about learning how to live with it. Even Egyptian literature played with this imagery. The Westcar Papyrus, full of royal storytelling, slips in scenes that feel like marketplaces, buzzing crowds, nocturnal settings, temptation, inversion. Light and dark weren't just backdrops, they were symbols of moral choice. To walk into a night market was to flirt with inversion. The orderly day overturned, social ranks scrambled, hidden desires aired. That's why the markets carried a dangerous allure. They weren't only about onions, beer, or charms. They symbolize temptation, chaos, inversion. And yet, they also symbolized resilience, community, balance. Just like Newt birthing the sun from her starry body each dawn, the market ended at sunrise, folding chaos back into order. So here's the truth. The night market wasn't Egypt's dirty secret. It was Egypt's shadow mirror. It reflected everything official Egypt tried to suppress: magic, inversion, freedom. But in doing so, it also kept the society whole. Without those nightly rituals of trade and story, the culture itself might have cracked. By stepping into this upside-down world, you don't just meet vendors. You meet gods. You meet myths. You meet the beating heart of a civilization that knew the night wasn't absence, it was the other half of existence. And once you've seen that, you can't go back to pretending Egypt lived only in the light.
You step through a crooked alley, and suddenly it hits you. The night market is alive. Not like the day markets you saw earlier. This is sharper, edgier, hungrier. The torches spit smoke, the lamps flicker, and every shadow could be a buyer, a seller, or someone you shouldn't be trusting. The ground crunches under your sandals, bits of reed mats, broken pottery, and fish scales. The stalls aren't neat stone booths like the daytime agora. They're makeshift, planks balanced on crates, woven mats laid directly on the dusty street. And the street itself? Narrow, claustrophobic, winding like a snake so that you can't see more than a few stalls ahead. Every turn feels like a reveal. Lighting was everything here. Archaeologists have dug up clusters of small oil lamps and soot-blackened burners near temple gates in Thebes and Memphis. Imagine tiny flames running on animal fat or vegetable oil, burning weak yellow light. It wasn't bright enough to flood the streets. It was just enough to show the gleam of a gold trinket, the wet scales of a Nile perch, the outline of someone's hand slipping coins from pouch to pouch. The rest were shadows. That half-seen world is what made the market thrilling. And then, the smell. Gods, the smell. Roasting fish sizzling over clay braziers, perfumes sharp with imported cinnamon or frankincense, fresh onions and garlic mixing with sweat, every scent fighting for dominance in the night air. You're not walking through an official marketplace now. You're walking through a space carved out at the city's edges. These night markets weren't sanctioned plazas with temple inspectors glaring down. They often lived in semi-private streets, alleys near city gates or right outside temple precinct walls. Technically out of bounds, but close enough to draw a crowd leaving evening rituals. It was commerce on the margins, physically and morally. And what did they sell? Almost anything daylight didn't cover, or wouldn't allow. First, the perishables. If you wanted fresh fish, you came here. Caught that day from the Nile, gutted fast, and sold before it spoiled. Same with seasonal fruits, pomegranates, figs, dates. You could feel the urgency in the seller's voice because if he didn't move his stock tonight, it rotted by sunrise. Then came the exotic. Imported spices like cinnamon, frankincense, or resin carried by caravan and smuggled discreetly through the city. Perfumes in tiny alabaster jars that promised seduction, status, or both. They weren't just luxuries, they were flexes. To be seen buying them meant you had wealth to burn. And the jewelry stalls. Don't picture Cartier. Picture mats covered in hand-strung beads, copper rings and amulets shaped like ankhs, scarabs, or little gods. Some were real gold, some fake. That was the gamble. And people still bought because each piece whispered a promise: protection, fertility, love. The line between a jewel and a spell was thin here. Which brings us to the illicit trade, the real heartbeat of the night.
This was where magic happened, literally. Amulets promising to cure disease, papyrus slips inked with love spells, counterfeit charms passed off as temple-blessed relics. If you wanted something the priests didn't sanction, this was your stop. It wasn't just petty crime, it was survival. People needed these objects to feel safe in a world where demons lurked in the night sky and snakes hid in the sand. But night markets weren't only about objects, they were about people. The cast of characters here was richer than any pharaoh's court. The vendors, often poor artisans, immigrants, or people pushed out of official guilds, selling at night meant avoiding taxes, dodging temple control, hustling for survival. The buyers, a crazy mix. On one hand, working-class folks grabbing cheap fish or charms. On the other, elites sneaking in for rare goods or forbidden indulgences, cloaks pulled tight, not wanting to be recognized. Night markets were the great equalizer, status blurred in the shadows. The entertainers, because what's trade without a show? Storytellers spinning myths, musicians strumming harps or pounding drums, dancers swaying in the torchlight. They weren't background noise, they were the glue. Without them, the market was just commerce. With them, it was community. And maybe most surprising, inspectors, or at least proto-police. There's evidence of officials or hired watchers roaming the night markets. They weren't there to kill the party. They were there to keep it from boiling over. It was a delicate balance. Let the people blow off steam, but stop it before it turned into riot or blasphemy. For one night, hierarchies bent. Immigrants could sell without guild approval. Women could barter or perform in ways daylight society frowned upon. The margins of Egypt came alive here. Precarious, yes, but powerful. And that's the beauty and the danger. The night market looked like freedom, but it was also a pressure cooker, a space where gossip flew unchecked. Rumors about tax collectors, priests, even Pharaoh himself. Archaeologists and historians suggest night markets doubled as political arenas, where people not only bought onions and amulets, but whispered dissent. Imagine leaning in to buy a loaf of bread and hearing the vendor mutter, "The grain taxes are killing us all. Even the scribes are grumbling." That kind of talk was dangerous in daylight. At night, it spread like fire. So, here we are, in the thick of it. The market is thriving. It feels unstoppable. This is the false victory, the sense that this shadow economy is untouchable, that it's too vital to fail. And yet, look closely. You'll see the cracks. Tension in the way the inspectors linger. Fear in the way vendors glance at the temple gates. Everyone knows dawn brings order. And maybe one day, crackdown. But tonight the lamps are still burning, the drums are still thundering, and the shadows still belong to the people.
You think the night market is wild already? Wait until you see the luxury stalls. By day, luxury belonged to the temples and the palaces. Perfumes, gold,
Imported spices. They were taxed, blessed, controlled. At night, all bets were off. This was where the city's appetite came out to play. Picture a cloth spread on the ground with glass jars of cinnamon, real cinnamon, shipped from as far as India. The smell hits you sharp, sweet, burning, unforgettable. You know it's contraband because even the way the vendor handles it feels secretive. He scoops a little into your palm and whispers the price like he's confessing a crime. And here's the kicker. He probably smuggled it in through temple storage routes, bribed a guard, cut corners on holy cargo. If you buy it, you're part of the crime too. Perfumes were the same game. Tiny alabaster jars filled with oils thick as honey. Some were genuine, made from blue lotus, frankincense, or myrrh. Others, straight-up fakes. Animal fat dyed with crushed petals to smell exotic. Didn't matter. Under torchlight, who could tell? You'd leave with a jar, convinced you'd bought seduction in liquid form. Next morning, you might realize you'd just paid a week's wages for rancid grease. And then the jewelry. Gold rings hammered into shape, bracelets strung with faience beads, amulets shaped like scarabs. Amulets were hot sellers. Some claimed to protect from snakes. Others promised fertility or luck in gambling. My favorite detail, some sellers leant hard into scams. They'd rub dirt on a new amulet and say, "This one, dug straight from a tomb, a real relic." Total lie. But who's going to argue at midnight with a guy holding a torch and a story? You'd think the elites avoided this chaos, but no, they came too. Hoods pulled low, servants carrying baskets, making hush-hush purchases of things they'd never dare buy in daylight. A nobleman might show up for a rare gem or an imported wine. A temple scribe might buy a charm to win over a lover. They wanted the thrill, and, more importantly, they wanted what the temples denied them. That's what made night markets dangerous. They blurred lines. Daylight Egypt ran on order, hierarchy, and ritual. At night, a fisherman might sell to a prince. A slave might out-haggle a scribe. A woman might perform songs that men of rank applauded. The market inverted the pyramid. For a few hours, power was negotiable.
But let's not romanticize it too much. Behind the freedom, there was also exploitation. Smuggling rings thrived here. Counterfeiters made a killing. Some stalls sold watered-down beer or fake spices at double the price. People got cheated constantly. But here's the brutal irony. They kept coming back anyway. Because the night market wasn't just about buying, it was about believing. Now picture the entertainers. Drummers pounding on stretched hide, dancers twirling scarves in the firelight, storytellers performing tales of gods wrestling chaos or ordinary fools getting rich by tricking kings. These weren't shows like in a theatre. They were raw, sweaty, close. You'd feel the drumbeat in your ribs while you haggled over onions. You'd watch a dancer sway while a vendor measured grain. Commerce and culture braided together, inseparable. And here's the kicker. This wasn't just fun. It was memory. People remembered the stories they heard at the markets. Folk tales changed shape here, like clay being reshaped by dozens of hands. The gossip mattered too. Rumours about grain shortages, about temple corruption, about the pharaoh's health. Markets were Egypt's newspapers, tabloids and talk shows all in one. But under the surface, tension. Always tension. Think of the inspectors. We don't have their names, but sources suggest they existed. Men hired to keep an eye on things, to stop outright chaos. Not temple priests, not full police, but watchers.
You'd feel their eyes on you while you haggled. Were they bribable? Probably. Did they shut down stalls? Sometimes. Their presence was like a shadow reminder this freedom was fragile. And that fragility showed in religion too. Egyptian cosmology painted night as dangerous, chaos, demons, the realm of the serpent Apophis. To trade after dark was, in some priests' eyes, to flirt with disorder. Imagine a priest walking past and seeing amulets traded under torchlight. To him, it wasn't just commerce, it was sin, a tear in the fabric of cosmic balance. That's what makes these markets so fascinating. They weren't just side hustles, they were ideological battlegrounds. On one side, people hustling to survive, to find joy, to get what daylight denied them. On the other, a worldview where night was to be feared, not celebrated. Every coin exchanged was a rebellion, tiny but real. And the social inversion, brutal and brilliant. Immigrants barred from daylight guilds suddenly became vital at night. Women, often sidelined in formal trade, stepped forward as sellers, performers, even brokers of magic. Day said no, night said, try me. That's why these spaces mattered. They gave the voiceless a stage, even if only by torchlight.
But let's pause here. Imagine yourself. You're standing in the market, coin pouch in hand. Do you buy the charm the vendor swears will keep your child safe? Do you trust the jar of lotus oil that smells suspiciously like goat fat? Or do you slip into the crowd to hear the drummer's beat? Or keep your distance because you notice the inspector's eyes flicking toward you? Every choice feels loaded. That's the atmosphere. Alive, risky, intoxicating. And yet it all comes with a timer. Dawn is the cutoff. Once the sun rises, the spell breaks. The markets vanish like smoke. The stalls collapse, the lamps gutter out, and the city pretends none of it happened. By daylight, order returns. The priests smile, the officials count taxes, the pharaoh's statues glitter, and everyone acts like the night never existed. But of course, it did. That's why archaeologists find scraps of it. Lamps, graffiti, broken amulets. That's why papyri hint at evening bazaars. That's why whispers of forbidden trade echo in temple decrees. The markets lived in the cracks of the official story. And cracks, if you look close enough, tell you more than the polished surface. Now, let's talk about the irony. The night markets look like freedom, but they also show dependence. People depended on them for fresh food, for charms, for social release. The elites depended on them for luxuries they couldn't admit to wanting. Even the officials depended on them to absorb the city's tensions, to let people blow off steam before rebellion boiled over. The market wasn't just tolerated, it was necessary. And that necessity is what makes this the false victory. Because in this moment, everything seems to thrive. The torches are bright, the vendors are loud, the crowd is thick. The economy hums, the gossip flows, the social pyramid bends. It feels like a win, like the night belongs to the people. But you can feel it, can't you? The fragility, the way a single crackdown could scatter it all, the way a single priest's denunciation could turn freedom into blasphemy. That tension is the heartbeat of the night market. Vibrant, essential, but never safe. And the crazy part, that's why people kept coming. Because danger makes things taste sharper. The fish feels fresher when you buy it at midnight. The perfume smells sweeter when it's technically illegal. The charm feels stronger when it's banned by priests.
Night markets weren't just markets, they were adrenaline. So, here's the truth. The night markets of ancient Egypt weren't just about trade. They were about human hunger. Hunger for survival, hunger for connection, hunger for meaning in the dark. And no decree, no priest, no inspector could kill that hunger. Not then, not ever.
Here's where the night market stops being just trade and starts being dangerous. Because once you've got crowds, once you've got people buzzing together under flickering torches, trade is only half the story. The other half? Talk, whispers, gossip, the kind that could topple reputations or kingdoms. Picture yourself leaning against a wooden stool. You're pretending to examine a necklace, but your ears are locked on the two men beside you. They're arguing about taxes, loud enough to be risky, quiet enough to think they're safe. One spits, "The temple takes grain for the gods, but the priests eat better than we do." The other mutters back, "Don't say that here." But he says it anyway, because night markets felt like a pocket of freedom. This is the false victory. People thought they could speak truth in the dark, and for a time they could. Night markets became Egypt's unofficial parliament. Not the grand halls, not the sacred courts, just clusters of people huddled between lamp smoke and spice stools, trading stories sharper than blades. Rumours of food shortages, whispers about Pharaoh's health, complaints about overseers pocketing wages. Imagine how intoxicating that felt. By day, mouths shut. By night, voices rose. And if you think gossip is trivial, think again. In ancient Egypt, rumour was power. A whisper could ruin a scribe's standing, challenge a priest's authority, or spark unrest in a work crew. Archaeologists find graffiti in workers' villages at Deir el-Medina, where men scribbled insults about foremen. That same spirit thrived here in the market shadows, except multiplied by hundreds of voices colliding at once. Now let's humanize it. You're in the crowd, you smell fish grilling somewhere. You hear a drumbeat, but what pulls you closer is a circle of listeners around a storyteller. He's spinning a tale. A greedy official cheats the people, and the gods punish him with boils. Everyone laughs. It's funny, yes, but it's also code. Everyone in the circle knows exactly which real official he means. The story is shield, dagger, and entertainment, all in one. That's how dissent survived, disguised as jokes, hidden in stories, traded like contraband. And where better than a market already thick with contraband? But here's the irony. Even as the market gave space for freedom, danger stalked it. Remember those inspectors? They weren't just watching prices, they were listening. You never knew if the man buying onions beside you was also noting down names. That's why every laugh came with a glance over their shoulder.
The elites knew this too. Some joined in. Some used the market to quietly test the public mood, sending servants to listen, to catch the flavour of discontent before it boiled over. In a sense, the night market was both threat and safety valve. Let people mutter in the dark, and maybe they won't riot in the day. And yet, there's always a limit. Historians call this the false victory moment, because everything feels alive, buzzing, unstoppable. The market looks like it's thriving. Trade is booming, songs are louder, gossip sharper. It feels like the city belongs to the people at night, like they've carved out real freedom. But under the surface, cracks. Religious authorities hated it. To them, these markets were chaos embodied. Night belonged to gods of disorder, Apophis, demons, spirits. Trading at night wasn't just risky, it was a cosmological insult. Every lamp lit in defiance of the sun felt like a challenge to Ma'at, the principle of order. You can bet some priests argued for crackdowns, warning that night trade invited curses. Officials feared it too, not just the gossip, but the informal economy. Goods slipping past taxes, smuggling, undermining temple monopolies. Every unlicensed sale was lost revenue. Every amulet sold outside the temple was a blow to priestly authority. You can almost hear the tension crackle in the air. A noble laughs at a street joke, but his servant shifts nervously, scanning the crowd for spies. A woman sells amulets in the corner, but keeps one eye trained on the inspector, ready to snatch her cloth and vanish. A storyteller whips up the crowd, but his heart pounds, because if he goes too far, tomorrow he's in chains. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine standing there as dawn creeps closer. You've bought your fish, you've heard the gossip, you've laughed at the jokes, but now the lamps sputter low. The stalls collapse into bundles, the entertainers vanish, and the silence that follows feels eerie, because you know, deep down, what you just saw wasn't supposed to exist. That's the fragility of the night market. It's freedom, but only in the dark, and only until the authorities decide it's too much. And yet, that fragility is also why it mattered so much. People don't risk gathering, trading, laughing, whispering in the dark unless it feeds something deep. The markets proved a truth the temples never admitted. People craved more than order. They craved connection. They craved choice. They craved space to breathe outside the iron grip of Mart.
Think of it this way. Every coin exchanged, every rumor told, every story laughed at was a tiny act of rebellion. A declaration. We exist outside your rules. That's why archaeologists and historians obsess over these scraps of evidence. They're windows into Egypt's undercurrent, its human heartbeat, not its carved stone facade. So yes, the night markets flourished. Yes, they buzzed with life, but don't mistake it for victory. The false victory of is this: the market looks untouchable, but it's already under watch. Its very success guarantees a backlash. The bigger the crowd, the louder the gossip, the brighter the torches, the more certain the crackdown becomes. And when that crackdown comes, it's not just stalls that vanish. It's freedom, it's voices, it's the fragile dream that the night could belong to the people. That's where this part leaves us, at the height of vibrancy, but standing on a knife's edge. The torches are bright, the music loud, the gossip biting, but the tension's already there, coiled tight, waiting. And the question hanging in the air is simple: how long can you dance in the dark before the sun burns it all away? The night market always felt fragile. Lamps flickering, voices lowered, freedom borrowed. But after its moment of triumph, the balance snapped. Authorities noticed, priests bristled, and the same dark corners that once promised liberation started to look like traps. Imagine this. You've just finished bargaining for a handful of figs. A towel crier pushes through the crowd with a papyrus roll and a voice like stone. He reads out a new decree. Let it be known, commerce after sundown is forbidden, unless authorized by the temple or the governor's office. Those caught will face fines, confiscation, and exile. That's not exaggeration. Surviving New Kingdom papyri record decrees restricting gatherings after nightfall, especially near temple walls and city gates, the very spaces where night markets thrived. The subtext was clear. Trade belonged to daylight, under watchful eyes of priests and scribes. Night was chaos, not commerce. and anyone trying to sell onions or amulets after dark was suddenly painted as a criminal. But here's the sting. You couldn't just pack up and sell by day. Day markets were monopolized by temple overseers or guilds and officials. The night gave ordinary traders a chance to breathe. With that cut off, you were cornered, obey and starve, or risk punishment. Authorities didn't just write decrees, they enforced them. Temple and state officials deployed what Ostraker described as market watchdogs, men paid to patrol the night, sniffing out illicit trade. Picture them, lanterns in hand, moving stall to stall, watching for contraband amulets or smuggled spices. If you were caught, best case scenario, they confiscated your goods and fined you. Worst case, you were hauled before local courts, flogged, or exiled. Exile wasn't metaphorical. It meant being torn from your community, dropped in some alien village, stripped of your connections. Now picture yourself as a vendor. Every sound in the night feels sharper. Every stranger's gaze could be an inspector's. Do you keep trading, or do you fold and run? Either way, the market's atmosphere shifts from buzzing freedom to whispered fear. And then came the rot from within. Competition between vendors had always existed. Who had the freshest fish, the cheapest figs, or the flashiest jewellery? But with inspectors lurking, paranoia spread. Accusations flew. She's the one telling the priests where we meet, or that man's been working both sides. Scholars note how rivalries in informal economies often collapse into betrayal. Some traders tipped off officials to eliminate competition. Others bribed inspectors to look the other way, which bred resentment. Imagine standing in a circle of vendors who once felt like family, now side-eyeing each other, half believing someone's an informant. The market no longer just smelled of spice and smoke, it reeked of mistrust. But it wasn't only about economics. For priests, night markets weren't just illegal, they were unholy. Egyptian cosmology drew sharp lines. Day was order, night was chaos. Day belonged to Ra, the sun god, upholding Ma'at, the cosmic balance. Night, by contrast, was the realm of Set, chaos embodied, Ammut, devourer of the wicked, and Apophis, the serpent enemy of the sun. So when priests saw people clustering in shadow, trading amulets, swapping stories, drinking and dancing, they didn't see community, they saw a threat to cosmic order. Horning 1999 even notes priests framing such gatherings as doorways to sin, impurity, and the breakdown of moral law. Some temple sermons thundered, "Do not bring the chaos of the day into the order of the day." Others warned that gods might withdraw protection from cities tolerating nocturnal corruption. For commoners, this was terrifying. Was your livelihood now a curse on your whole town?
Imagine selling a necklace and hearing a priest shout from the steps of the temple that your stall invites Set's wrath. You don't just fear officials, you fear the gods. And while priests thundered about morality, the pharaohs had their own agenda: control. Rulers like Amenhotep III and Ramesses II weren't content to leave trade in local hands. They centralized, they tightened monopolies, they ensured temples and palaces got the first cut of every valuable import. Night markets were obstacles. They were pipelines of untaxed wealth, alternative power structures in the shadows. For kings obsessed with projecting order, that was unacceptable. So royal decrees grew harsher. Soldiers sometimes marched alongside inspectors, and suddenly the free space of the market felt like a hunted ground. Human aside, imagine the shift. A decade ago, your mother laughed under torchlight while buying fish at the night market. Now you're standing in the same square and soldiers' sandals crunch past the stalls. The same space that once smelled of fish and perfume now stinks of fear. By the time crackdowns intensified, night markets were caught in a vice. From above, priests preaching doom, kings enforcing central control. From within, neighbours betraying neighbours, trust eroding. From outside, inspectors roaming, waiting for mistakes. The very things that once gave the markets life, their informality, their marginality, their freedom, became liabilities. The lamps still flickered, the voices still rose, but each word now carried risk. Each coin exchanged could be the one that bought exile. And yet, they kept coming. Why? Because hunger doesn't pause for degrees, because stories still need telling, because even in fear, people cling to spaces that make them feel human. Imagine this, you're a vendor in Thebes, the air thick with smoke from oil lamps, the chatter of buyers and sellers echoing under the stars. You've set up your stall like you've done dozens of times before, offering trinkets, bread, maybe a few charms for travellers heading out of town. Then you see them, inspectors, watchdogs, men carrying tablets and styluses, recording names, prices, faces. Suddenly the same lamps that made the market feel alive now feel like spotlights. Every joke, every deal, every whisper of barter feels dangerous. That's the tone of this period in Egyptian history, the walls closing in.
By the late New Kingdom, the pharaohs weren't just rulers. They were CEOs, priests, generals, and gods rolled into one. Their reach stretched everywhere. And night markets, those messy, decentralized spaces where people traded without temple blessing, were easy targets. Administrative papyri under Straka don't just describe abstract laws. They tell us about real decrees issued to choke off this kind of unsanctioned activity. No more stalls after sundown. No more gathering near temple gates. Violators weren't just fined. They could be stripped of goods, forced out of their homes, even exiled. That's not a slap on the wrist. That's economic death. And here's the kicker. The enforcers weren't faceless. They were your neighbour's cousins, temple scribes, even old market buddies who'd flipped to survive. Imagine standing beside a friend one week, selling bread side by side, only to watch them a month later in an inspector's sash, scribbling down your name. That's betrayal sharpened by survival instinct. Temples weren't just churches. There were banks, courts, and warehouses. They hated competition. And to justify their crackdown, priests didn't just say, "This hurts revenue." They dressed it up as cosmic warfare. To Egyptian priests, the universe was a delicate balance. Mart, order, versus Isfet, chaos. Every unsanctioned gathering at night, every deal cut under torchlight, felt like a crack in the cosmic ceiling. They painted night markets as breeding grounds of impurity, chaotic laughter, sexual looseness, tricksters selling fake amulets. They invoked Set, the god of disorder, and Amut, the devourer of souls, to say, if you buy here, you're inviting corruption into your soul. That's some next-level propaganda, and people bought it. Or at least enough did to make life hell for vendors. Imagine being accused not just of tax evasion, but of undermining the gods. How do you fight back against that? Let's slow down and picture this. You're in Memphis. Night is heavy with heat. Lamps flicker against mud brick walls. The market has just started buzzing. Then, like a cold wind, the inspectors sweep in. Ostrika from Thebes record their existence. Market watchdogs, assigned to patrol nocturnal gatherings. They weren't an army, but their presence carried weight. One entry on a tablet might mean confiscation. 2 entries, exile. Think about how that plays out. Stalls scatter. Performers hide their drums. Buyers pull their cloaks tighter and walk past away, leaving you exposed. Your bread unsold, your copper trinkets worthless. Do you pack up before they reach you, or do you risk selling one last charm to the old woman, begging for protection from the evil eye? These weren't just raids. They were psychological warfare. Every night you risked showing up, the bad guys weren't faceless villains. They were the state itself, cloaked in law, religion, and authority.
Here's where it gets darker. The market community itself started breaking apart. Competition had always existed. Vendors undercutting prices, spreading rumors about rivals. But under surveillance, mistrust spread like fire. Accusations of betrayal became common. Who tipped off the inspectors last week? Why did that guy's stall survive untouched while yours got raided? People whispered about informants, traders who sold their own for survival. This is what happens when pressure mounts. Communities fracture. The solidarity that once kept vendors safe, sharing lamps, pooling bribes, covering each other's stalls, crumbled. Rival factions emerged, scrapping for control of shrinking scraps of the underground economy. What was once a lively, chaotic, but cooperative scene turned into paranoia. It's one thing to fear the government, it's another to fear your own neighbour. Meanwhile, the pharaohs were centralizing harder than ever. Amenhotep III, Ramesses II, big names, big moves. They tightened state control, hoarded wealth in temples, locked trade into monopolies. Every official policy screamed the same message. The anti-markets worth existing are ours. Independent traders? Too risky. Smugglers? Cut off. Night markets? Crushed. Picture a fisherman who sold catches at dusk to feed his family. Now he's told, either hand your fish to the temple warehouse or risk exile selling at night. That's not a choice. It's a slow starvation dressed as law. And here's where it hits home. When authorities centralize, it's not just the economy they're killing. They're suffocating culture. The music, the storytelling, the jokes cracked over late-night bread, gone. What's left is sterile, controlled, daylight-only trade. Orderly, yes. Alive? Not even close. It's like watching your favourite underground club scene get gentrified out of existence. At first, the cops only check IDs. Then they slap fines. Then your landlord hikes rent. Suddenly the bands are gone, the walls are painted beige, and instead of sweat and music, you get silence and corporate playlists. The Egyptian night markets weren't clubs, but the vibe was the same. A pulse of life snuffed out by systems that preferred control over chaos. And just like today, the loss wasn't just economic, it was emotional, cultural, spiritual. Priests weren't passive either. They saw night markets not just as economic rivals, but as cosmic threats. Horning 1999 describes how they explicitly linked night gatherings with sin. Imagine sermons, if we can call them that, preached inside temple courtyards, railing against those who mock the gods with laughter at night.
It's brilliant in a sinister way. By branding night markets as dangerous to souls, they got ordinary people to turn against them too. Neighbours might start shaming each other. Why do you go there? Don't you fear divine punishment? It's not just surveillance anymore. It's social pressure. And when that combines with legal crackdowns, communities collapse from the inside out. Every time I read about this, I think about how modern societies repeat the same script. Governments pass laws against gatherings, religious leaders demonize them, neighbors start policing each other. Whether it's underground jazz in the 1920s America, raves in the 1990s, or protest movements today, the pattern rhymes. Power hates uncontrolled spaces. Egypt was no different. The bad guys weren't villains twirling mustaches, they were structures, systems, and fears squeezing tighter every night. Picture it. The inspectors are still prowling, but now the fear has sunk deeper. It's no longer about dodging a patrol, it's about realizing the very ground beneath your stall is shifting. The pharaoh's grip isn't just visible in decrees and laws,
It's coded into daily life, into where you're allowed to stand, when you're allowed to speak, what you're allowed to sell. The bad guys don't need to shout anymore. Their silence, their absence of tolerance, is louder than any raid. You need to understand how priests became not just opponents, but propagandists in this fight. Egyptian cosmology was obsessed with balance. Ma'at wasn't some vague order, it was literally the fabric holding society, the cosmos, the afterlife together. Disrupt Ma'at, and you weren't just breaking rules, you were pulling at the threads of the universe. That's heavy. So when priests branded night markets as sinful, they weren't just wagging fingers, they were casting vendors as agents of cosmic decay. Selling bread at night became rebellion against the gods. Swapping charms under torchlight turned into heresy. And let's be real, most people are deeply superstitious when survival's on the line. If your neighbour insists that your child's sickness came from buying bread from the impure ones after sundown, do you argue? Or do you avoid that market forever? Fear spreads faster than reason. This is how cancel culture worked 3,000 years ago. Once a priest labels you unclean, you don't get a chance to explain. You're out. Done. Persona non grata. Doesn't matter if you sold good bread or fake charms, the label sticks. By now, inspectors weren't the only threat. Informants were everywhere.
Imagine this. You're a vendor selling fish. The guy 2 stalls down sells the same fish, but cheaper. You're losing customers. So you lean into an inspector, mutter, he bribes guards with counterfeit charms. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter. The inspector notes it down. Next week, your rival's stall is gone. His family, starving. You, safer. For now. This wasn't just commerce anymore. It was survival of the ruthless. Trust eroded, alliances broke, and the night market, which had once thrived on messy communal energy, started eating itself alive. If you've ever seen a workplace under extreme layoffs, you know the vibe. People stop collaborating. Co-workers whisper about each other to bosses. Everyone's looking out for themselves. That's what night markets turned into, a paranoia factory. Now let's pull the lens back. This wasn't happening in isolation. Pharaohs like Amenhotep III and Ramesses II were centralizers. They didn't just build temples, they absorbed wealth into them. They didn't just rule cities, they restructured economies. Kemp makes it clear, independent trade wasn't a bug, it was a threat. Every loaf of bread sold outside temple control was lost revenue. Every amulet bought at night was a ritual unblessed by priests. So the pharaohs closed ranks. They enforced tighter monopolies, funneled grain and fish through warehouses, and forced sellers into daylight markets controlled by the state. What does that mean for the night vendors? You either played by daylight rules, taxes, temple oversight, scripted rituals, or you risked your livelihood sneaking back into the shadows. And every time you snuck back, the risk doubled. One of the lifelines for night markets had always been smugglers. These weren't pirates, they were the guys who slipped goods through the gaps in the system. Maybe they brought imported oils, maybe rare stones, maybe just cheaper grain. But as centralization tightened, so did border patrols and checkpoints. Smuggling routes got cut off. Suddenly, the exotic goods that once gave night markets their shimmer disappeared. Think about how that changes atmosphere. Without smugglers, stalls look dull. No rare perfumes, no charms from far-off Nubia. Just bread, fish, and desperation. The magic thinned out. It's like when your favourite local street market starts losing vendors because rent hikes push them out. 1 week it's vibrant and buzzing. A month later, half the stalls are gone. You still go, but it doesn't feel the same. That's what late period night markets were. Half alive ghosts of themselves. The real tragedy
is how fear becomes routine. At first, raids shock you. Then you adapt. You learn to sell quicker, to keep one eye on the customer and one eye on the shadows, to hide goods under mats, to stash charms in clay jars, to memorize escape routes. Night vendors became survival artists. But survival isn't the same as living.
Imagine a musician trying to perform while keeping an ear tuned for guards. Imagine a storyteller rushing his tale, chopping out details because inspectors might arrive mid-performance. The art itself starts to wither under pressure. History repeats because power behaves the same way. You see the same squeeze in authoritarian states today. Independent newspapers vanish, underground clubs get raided, protesters get branded as chaotic. The trick is always the same. Call disorder danger, then centralize under the excuse of safety. Egypt's crackdown on night markets isn't an ancient quirk, it's a playbook. And just when things look bad, the priests pile on harder. They don't just warn of sin, they start invoking Set directly. Set wasn't just a trickster, he was the embodiment of chaos, the killer of Osiris. Associating night markets with Set was the ultimate curse. To the average Egyptian, that's terrifying. It's not just you'll get a fine, it's the god of chaos will claim your soul. Imagine how that shapes perception. Even if inspectors weren't nearby, the fear of cosmic punishment haunted the air. You didn't need physical soldiers when invisible gods did the work for you. By now, the night market was no longer the vibrant, community-driven space it once was. It was a battlefield of whispers, fear, and scarcity. Vendors cut each other down with lies, priests thundered against them, inspectors circled like hawks. And yet, people still came, because hunger doesn't disappear, because charms still mattered, because music still gave relief. And then, one day, silence. The night markets that once throbbed with noise and colour evaporated almost overnight. Archaeology shows it clearly, layers at Thebes and Memphis where oil lamps vanish from the record, where counterfeit amulets stop appearing, where market stalls are simply abandoned. It's like someone pulled the plug on a living organism. This wasn't just policy, it was a purge. Pharaohs like Ramesses II didn't just close the markets, they erased them. Spaces once alive with laughter and trade were rebuilt as administrative offices or temple courtyards. Imagine your favourite nightlife district turned into a government building. That's the kind of cultural death we're talking about. And it hit hard. Vendors disappeared, exiled, jailed, or simply broken. Entertainers lost their stages, families who depended on nocturnal trade slid into poverty. The night, once alive with possibility, became a vacuum of fear. The real tragedy for ordinary Egyptians was more than economics. Night markets had been escape valves, places to hear forbidden songs, to whisper truths, to slip free of the day's suffocating order. Their collapse wasn't just the end of an economy, it was the end of a culture of freedom. Picture standing in one of those old alleys centuries later. No laughter, no music, just stone, silence, and a faint memory of torches. That's what all is lost feels like, not just history fading, but voices cut off mid-sentence. The night markets died, and with them, a piece of Egypt's soul.
The crackdown didn't just kill the marketplace, it broke people. For vendors who lived hand to mouth, the sudden loss of their night stalls meant not just fewer coins, but no bread for their children, no roof over their heads, no place to belong. Ostraca from this period hint at displacement and despair, artisans lamenting exile, immigrants disappearing from the records, families stripped of the fragile networks that had held them together. The night markets had been more than places of trade, they were social lifelines. Without them, the weavers, entertainers, and small-time traders found themselves scattered and voiceless.
The music that once floated through torchlit alleys fell silent. The storytellers who had carried ancestral memory through their voices were forced back to obscurity. The collapse wasn't just economic, it was cultural amnesia. Imagine your favourite cafe or local corner spot suddenly shuttered, not because it wasn't profitable, but because someone powerful decided it didn't fit. Now imagine that multiplied across a city, and you're one of the invisible people it fed and sheltered. That's what these Egyptians lived. But beyond the hunger and silence lay something deeper, a spiritual wound. For Egyptians, the night was not just darkness, it was mystery, transformation, even possibility. Deities like Khonsu, the moon god, and Nut, the sky goddess, represented protection, healing, and the eternal cycle of renewal. To walk through a night market wasn't just to buy or sell, it was to dwell, however briefly, in a liminal space between the sacred and the profane, between order and chaos. When the authorities shut those spaces down, it wasn't just an economic blow, it was the symbolic suffocation of hidden spiritualities, of desires and voices that only felt safe to emerge under the cover of night. The crackdown became a metaphor for how a society policed not just bodies and coins, but imagination itself. Think about that moment where you're in a crowd at night, music in the air, strangers talking freely, energy buzzing. There's a kind of freedom in it, like the rules don't matter for a few hours. Now picture that being declared illegal, stamped out, erased. That's more than loss, that's grief. Yet Egypt didn't stop dreaming when the markets fell. Survival has always had its own underground. Evidence suggests that while the stalls and torches disappeared, commerce and culture didn't vanish, they simply slipped into the cracks. Traders relocated to hidden alleys, shifted hours, or blended their goods into religious festivals that still allowed gatherings after dark. If the state banned night markets, people found loopholes.
Clandestine trade in amulets and charms continued well into later periods, showing that demand for these goods and the beliefs tied to them never really died. And while the authorities could shut down torch-lit stalls, they couldn't kill the oral traditions, the songs and the whispered rumours that carried on in homes and taverns after sundown. This resilience echoes across time. Centuries later, medieval Cairo would explode with its own thriving night bazaars, a spiritual descendant of these lost Egyptian markets. The continuity is striking, proof that while rulers can erase spaces, they can't erase the human hunger for freedom, trade, and freedom after dark. Think of it like music. You can smash the instrument, but the song survives in memory, waiting to be played again. That's what the night markets were, a melody Egypt couldn't forget, even when the stage was torn down. And so, out of the silence, a new synthesis emerged. The markets, as they once were gone, but their spirit lingered, reborn in festivals, in private gatherings, in the cultural DNA of a people who refused to give up their nights. The death of one form became the seed of another. The night markets fell, but the hunger they answered, the need for freedom, community, and a place where the hidden could breathe, endured. And that endurance is his own victory. By now you've seen both sides of Egypt, the polished one etched in stone, and the hidden one whispered in alleys. And that's the real tension at the heart of this story. Order versus freedom. Sacred versus profane. Light versus dark. Egypt sold itself to the world then and now as a civilization of balance, harmony, Ma'at, the cosmic order upheld by pharaohs and priests. Temples carved in perfection, pyramids aligned with the stars, rituals choreographed like clockwork. That was the daylight story. But the night?
the night told another truth. The night markets were messy, loud, human. They laughed at order. They blurred boundaries, sacred chants blending with street songs, holy amulets sold next to fish stew, gossip passed as eagerly as wine. They weren't just places of trade, they were living contradictions, proving Egypt wasn't just the statue in the museum, but the heartbeat in the shadows.
Think about your city. In the day, it's glass buildings, offices, uniforms. But at night, the bars, the food stalls, the little joints where rules soften. Egypt had that same duality, and without it, you don't get the full picture of who they were. Historians for centuries obsessed over the official Egypt, the grand tombs, the priests chanting hymns, the state-controlled marketplaces, neatly taxed and recorded. That's the Egypt you see in textbooks, everything in its place, as if chaos never dared creep in. But archaeology and whispers in the records reveal otherwise. Ostracar describing illicit exchanges, tomb inscriptions hinting at displaced workers. Even myths, like those of Hathor's drunken festivals, crack open the facade. They suggest another Egypt humming beneath the official narrative, a world that existed but was never meant to be archived. The night markets lived in that gap, and that's what makes them so compelling. They force us to admit Egypt wasn't one single story. It was a tug of war between control and freedom, temple law and human hunger, daylight respectability and nighttime indulgence. History textbooks are like Instagram. They show the curated feed. The night markets, that's the messy group chat. And if you only see one, you don't really know the people. Nowhere was this tension sharper than in how religion and markets collided after dark. Egyptians didn't separate the sacred from the everyday the way we tend to. Buying a charm for love, selling a potion for fertility, trading amulets promising protection. These weren't just market goods, they were spiritual lifelines. Night markets blurred these lines further. By torchlight, the divine and the profane touched shoulders. A priest might whisper blessings on charms sold at a stall, while a dancer swayed just a few feet away. A mother could buy fish for her children and a spell to ward off illness in the same breath. Officially, this mingling was suspect, even dangerous. But unofficially, it was the rhythm of survival. The night made room for things the temples wouldn't sanction in daylight. Ever bought incense at a street corner? Not for religion, exactly, but because you just wanted to breathe in something hopeful? Imagine that, but multiplied across a city, woven into survival itself. That was Egypt's night market spirituality. The state's crackdown on these markets, especially after the New Kingdom, was brutal. Livelihoods collapsed, communities scattered, cultural spaces disappeared. But here's the twist. The markets never truly died. They morphed, adapted, and hid in plain sight.
By the late New Kingdom, the pharaohs weren't just rulers. They were CEOs, priests, generals, and gods rolled into one. Their reach stretched everywhere. And night markets, those messy, decentralized spaces where people traded without temple blessing, were easy targets. Administrative papyri under Straka don't just describe abstract laws. They tell us about real decrees issued to choke off this kind of unsanctioned activity. No more stools after sundown. No more gathering near temple gates. Violators weren't just fined. They could be stripped of goods, forced out of their homes, even exiled. That's not a slap on the wrist. That's economic death. And here's the kicker. The enforcers weren't faceless. They were your neighbour's cousins, temple scribes, even old market buddies who'd flipped to survive. Imagine standing beside a friend one week, selling bread side by side.
only to watch them a month later in an inspector's sash scribbling down your name. That's betrayal sharpened by survival instinct. Temples weren't just churches, there were banks, courts, and warehouses. They hated competition. And to justify their crackdown, priests didn't just say, "This hurts revenue." They dressed it up as cosmic warfare. To Egyptian priests, the universe was a delicate balance. Ma'at, order, versus Isfet, chaos. Every unsanctioned gathering at night, every deal cut under torchlight, felt like a crack in the cosmic ceiling. They painted night markets as breeding grounds of impurity, chaotic laughter, sexual looseness, tricksters selling fake amulets. They invoked Set, the god of disorder, and Amut, the devourer of souls, to say, if you buy here, you're inviting corruption into your soul. That's some next-level propaganda, and people bought it. Or at least enough did to make life hell for vendors. Imagine being accused not just of tax evasion, but of undermining the gods. How do you fight back against that? Let's slow down and picture this. You're in Memphis. Night is heavy with heat. Lamps flicker against mud brick walls. The market has just started buzzing. Then, like a cold wind, the inspectors sweep in. Ostrika from Thebes record their existence. Market watchdogs, assigned to patrol nocturnal gatherings. They weren't an army, but their presence carried weight. One entry on a tablet might mean confiscation. 2 entries, exile. Think about how that plays out. Stalls scatter. Performers hide their drums. Buyers pull their cloaks tighter and walk fast away, leaving you exposed. Your bread unsold, your copper trinkets worthless. Do you pack up before they reach you, or do you risk selling one last charm to the old woman, begging for protection from the evil eye? These weren't just raids. They were psychological warfare. Every night you risked showing up, the bad guys weren't faceless villains. They were the state itself, cloaked in law, religion, and authority.
Here's where it hits close. This isn't just ancient history. Every city with a night market today, from Bangkok to Lagos to Mexico City, echoes Egypt's hidden economy. They're places where legality blurs, where food, ritual, gossip, and trade intermingle, where freedom sneaks out when the official world isn't watching. So the real question isn't just what were Egypt's night markets, it's why do humans always build them? And what do they say about us? Maybe they prove that no society, however ordered, is ever complete without its shadow life. Maybe they show that freedom, once tasted, always finds a way to survive, even if it has to go underground. Think about it. You probably have your own night market, a late night bar, a WhatsApp group, a corner shop where the rules bend. That's your version of Egypt's torchlit alleys. So here's where we are. Egypt's daylight was all about control, order, mut, but the night markets revealed something else. Messy, vibrant, dangerous, human. And even when crushed, they adapted, resurfaced and carried forward into festivals, bazaars and cultural memory. This is Egypt not as statue-still perfection, but as living contradiction. A civilization that taught the world about balance, yet only survived because of the shadows balancing the light. History books want to show Egypt as a pyramid, but Egypt was also the alley behind it, filled with noise, smell, gossip, and freedom. You can't understand one without the other. Picture this. Egypt's torches burned out, the night market stalls shuttered, and silence filled the streets where laughter and bargaining once echoed. For those who lived off the shadows, it must have felt like the world itself had died. Yet history has a way of whispering through ruins, reminding us that nothing truly disappears. It only changes form. The finale of this story isn't about the destruction. It's about what survived,
what adapted, and what it means for us today. The official record makes Egypt look pristine, almost robotic. Temples rising with geometric perfection, rituals carved into stone, pharaohs holding marked in their hands as if the whole universe bowed in submission. But beneath that curated daylight, the markets of night proved something rawer. Egypt was human, and in that humanity, contradiction lived. People worshipped gods at dawn and bought forbidden charms at dusk. They upheld ritual purity in daylight and downed jars of beer at festivals after dark. They worked in Pharaoh's service, then snuck out to sell trinkets in alleys. That contradiction wasn't weakness, it was the very engine of survival. A civilization that rigid couldn't have lasted without flexibility in the shadows. Egypt wasn't just statues and hymns. It was whispered deals, backroom laughter, and firelit improvisation. You can almost feel it, right? Like the city itself had two pulses, one steady, one chaotic, and together they made it alive. When authorities cracked down, the people didn't just surrender. They disguised freedom inside sanctioned rituals. Festivals became the loophole. Take the Festival of Drunkenness, honouring Hathor. By day, it was framed as religious devotion. By night, it was a frenzy, music, dance, intoxication. And within that cover, trade and exchange could sneak back in. Spices swapped, amulets sold, gossip carried. The sacred mask allowed the profane to live. This wasn't rebellion for its own sake, it was survival. Mothers needed food, healers needed herbs, artisans needed buyers. You couldn't legislate away human need. So the people reshaped the night market into new forms, slipping it into spaces where priests and officials couldn't kill it without killing their own rituals. Think about that resilience. It's the same way street vendors today blend into parades, or bootleggers hide inside music festivals. Freedom doesn't fight authority head-on, it slips into its blind spots and survives. Archaeology doesn't just tell us what was destroyed, it tells us what lived on. Long after official decrees silenced the markets, amulets and charms kept turning up in tombs and homes. That meant people were still buying, still trading, still believing. Even later, under Greco-Roman rule, the bazaars of Egypt buzzed again with nighttime energy. Different rulers, different customs, but the heartbeat was familiar. Humans carving out their own economy in the shadows. So when we look at the ruins, it's not just about what ended, it's about continuity. A straight line connects those hidden markets to later traditions in Cairo's medieval bazaars, and even to today's global night economies. The story didn't stop, it shifted.
Here's the thing. You can't kill the night. You can dim it, repress it, outlaw it, but people will always find each other in the dark. Why? Because night is freedom. It's where people experiment, cross boundaries, indulge desires, and share secrets. Daylight demands masks. Night lets them slip. That's why the suppression of Egypt's night markets feels so crushing. It wasn't just economics. It was cultural, spiritual, personal. And yet, like water pressing against stone, freedom leaped through cracks until it returned in new form. It reminds me of cities now. Governments try to regulate nightlife, but no matter how many curfews you impose, people find rooftops, back rooms, hidden bars. Because freedom isn't granted, it's taken. And Egypt's night markets prove that truth has been alive for millennia.
The real legacy of Egypt's night markets aren't the stalls or the goods. It's the reminder that official history is always half the story. The textbooks talk about Maat, pyramids, priests. The night markets whisper about struggle, survival, rebellion. Together, they give us the whole Egypt. Think about that when you walk through a museum. The polished artifacts are only one voice. The scratched ostraca, the cheap trinkets, the fragments. They're the other voice, the one telling you about people who lived after the sun went down. Without them, Egypt looks like a machine. With them, it looks alive. We're left with debate scholars still wrestle with. Were the markets totally illegal or sometimes tolerated? Were they permanently destroyed or did they dissolve slowly? How much of what we call night markets bled into festivals and sacred nights? The records are incomplete, the ruins partial, the stories scattered. And maybe that's fitting. Night markets were never meant to be fully recorded. They lived in shadows, in whispers, in moments not carved in stone. The uncertainty is part of their truth. It also forces us to confront our own blind spots. What parts of our world will survive in ruins? Will it be the skyscrapers and official speeches? Or the late-night stalls, the underground scenes, the messy spaces where real life thrived? And so, we come to the final image. Imagine Egypt at dawn. The last lamps sputter out. The markets are gone. Their trace is swept away by decree and silence. But in the quiet, you can still feel the echo. The laughter that once bounced off walls. The bargaining cries. The whispers of prayers over charms.
The city wakes into daylight order again. But now you know what hides beneath that order. You know Egypt wasn't just statues and hymns, but also shadows and songs. The story began in darkness, with the thrill of markets lit by torches. It ends in the same city, now bathed in sunrise. But your vision has changed. You no longer see Egypt as just the perfect daylight kingdom. You see the contradictions, the hidden lives, and the resilience of freedom. That's the real transformation, not theirs, but yours. Ancient Egypt wanted to be remembered for its eternal order, and it was. But the night markets prove it was also a place of chaos, invention, and survival. That's the Egypt history almost erased. Maybe that's why we're so fascinated by it, because deep down we know every society, including ours, lives in that tension. Daylight shows the official story, night reveals the truth. So when you next hear about Egypt's temples and pharaohs, remember the stalls too. Remember the amulet sellers, the dancers, the cooks, the gamblers, the whispered deals under torchlight. Remember the people who carved out freedom in the dark, even when the state tried to smother it. Because in the end, Egypt wasn't just the pyramid. Egypt was the alley behind it, alive with sound, smell, danger, and hope. And as the final torches die, dawn breaks, not just over Egypt, but over our understanding. We don't just see monuments now. We see the people. We see their night. We see their fight to exist.